Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Pesachim. We are up to Perek Chet, Mishnah Zayin. Today's Mishnayot should be Leilu Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Aranbayev, and Eliyahu ben Burchai Israelov, Menuchatam beGan Eden, Amen. The Mishnah teaches some other laws regarding the makeup of a group bringing the Pesach offering. The Mishnah begins, En shochatin et ha-Pesach aleyechid divrei Rabbi Yehuda. We may not slaughter the Pesach offering for an individual, meaning if there is only one person registered on it. These are the words of Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda bases this on the verse in Sefer Dvarim, chapter 16, pasuk 5, Lo tuchal lizboch et ha-Pesach be'achad sharecha. You may not slaughter the Pesach offering in one of your cities. He expounds the phrase in one to refer to a group consisting of only one person. Rabbi Yossi matir, but Rabbi Yossi permits it. Now Rabbi Yossi bases this on the verse said in regard to registering people on a Pesach in Sefer Shemot, chapter 12, pasuk 4, which states each man according to what he eats, which implies, according to Rabbi Yossi, even a single person. And Rabbi Yossi continues, Afilu chavura shel mea shenichulin le'echol kazait. Even if there is a group of 100 people that includes some who cannot eat an olive's volume of meat, and shochatin alehen, we may not slaughter a Pesach for them. And the Rav explains that Rabbi Yossi means to stress, lo talia minta ela ba'achila. The number of people in the group does not matter. The important thing is that each member of the group must be able to eat the minimum amount. Yachid ve'echol echol kazait. An individual is able to eat a kazait of the meat. Shochatin alav. We slaughter it just for him. Mea ve'en kol echad me'em yichulin echol kazait. 100 people in the group and some cannot eat a kazait of the meat. And shochatin alehem. Then we cannot slaughter it for them. And the Rav does right. V'alachak Rabbi Yossi. The halacha follows the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. The Mishnah continues now with another law. Ve'nosin chavurat nashim ba'avadim uktanim. We may not form a group consisting only of women and Canaanite slaves, or of slaves and minors when slaughtering a Korban Pesach, because the Canaanite slaves might behave immorally with the women or minors. Now the Rav explains it is acceptable to have a group of slaves alone or women alone, but we cannot have a mixed group of slaves and women or slaves and children, since a group eats the Pesach together, as we learned in chapter 7, Mishnah 13, and leaving slaves alone with women or with children might lead to immoral behavior between them. And that is the end of Mishnah Zayin. We continue now with Mishnah Chet. In Mishnah 6, we learned that we may slaughter the Pesach offering for people who are ineligible to eat from the offering on that day, if they will be able to eat from it that night. The Mishnah now discusses this law in regard to other offerings. The Mishnah will differentiate in certain cases between the Pesach and other offerings. The Mishnah begins, Onen tovel ve'ochel et pischol ha'erev. And onen, someone who, God forbid, loses one of his 7 closest relatives, which is the father, mother, brother, sister, son, daughter, or spouse, enters a state called aninut, which lasts until burial, and he is known as an onen. An onen is biblically forbidden to eat from sacrificial offerings until nightfall of the day on which the death occurred. However, rabbinic law extends this prohibition to the night after a death as well, even if the relative was buried during that day. But our Mishnah writes, an onen immerses himself in a mikveh on Erev Pesach and eats his Pesach offering that evening. Now, since an onen is not allowed to eat offerings during the day, we are concerned that he may have lost focus on remaining tahor and absent-mindedly come into contact with the source of tumah, whose purification requires immersion and waiting until nightfall. We therefore require the onen to immerse himself in a mikveh before eating the Pesach offering. Avalo b'kodashim, the Mishnah says, but an onen may not eat from other offerings on the night after a close relative's death because of a rabbinic prohibition. Now the rabbis extended the laws of onen to the night after the death as well, like we have just stated. However, the rabbis waived this prohibition only for the sake of the Pesach offering, since it is a mitzvah that carries a penalty of karet, but not for other offerings. Now we know there is a mitzvah to eat all the offerings that are supposed to be eaten. However, only the Pesach offering carries a penalty of karet, as the Torah writes in Sefer Shemot, chapter 29, pasuk 33. And the commentaries add that actually the karet penalty applies only to someone who fails to bring the Pesach offering, not to someone who fails to eat it. However, if we would prohibit him to eat from the offering that night, he would not be allowed to bring it. Therefore, the rabbis did not prohibit the onen from eating the Pesach that night. Now, the Mishnah discusses the rule for people who have the rabbinic status of an onen during the daytime. Hashomeh al meto, someone who hears about his deceased relative, meaning he hears that his relative died sometime before today, which the commentaries add that it has to be within 30 days of the time. The death has to be within 30 days of the time he heard of the death. If the passing was more than 30 days before, he is not an onen at all, as Maran writes in Shulchan Aruch Yoreh De'ah, chapter 402, halachot 1 and 2. But anyways, in our case, where he heard it within 30 days of the passing, v'amlaket lo atzamot, or someone who was having his parents' bones gathered for reburial, which the commentators explain in times of the Mishnah, it was common for people to bury their dead in moist earth until the body decomposed, and then gather the bones and rebury them in a drier family plot. So on the day the bones are gathered, the living relative is considered a mourner. Both the onen and this person who was having his parents' bones gathered for reburial have the rabbinic status of onen on that day. Tovel ve'ochel b'kodashim. He immerses himself in a mikveh and may eat from all the offerings on the following night, since even during that day, his onen status was only rabbinic, and the rabbis did not extend their prohibition to the following night. Now, the commentaries do add, the Mishnah refers to someone whose parents' bones are being gathered by others. If he gathered them himself, he became tameh for 7 days by touching them and may not eat offerings that night. Important to note. And the Mishnah continues, Ger shenit gayer b'erev Pesach. If a convert to Judaism converted on Erev Pesach, meaning he was circumcised for the purpose of conversion that day, Bet Shammai Omrim, Bet Shammai say, Tovel ve'ochel et pischo la'erev, he immerses himself in a mikveh that day to complete the conversion process and may then eat his Pesach offering that night. We know, Maran writes in Shulchan Aruch Yoreh De'ah, chapter 268, halachot 1 and 2, that a person who wishes to convert to Judaism must undergo both circumcision in the case of a man and immersion in a mikveh. Ubet Hillel omrim, but Bet Hillel say, Haporesh min ha'olah keporesh min ha'kever. Someone who separates from the foreskin is like someone who separates from a grave, meaning just as a person who became tameh from a corpse cannot become taor unless he is sprinkled with mechatat, ash from the paraduma, mixed with spring water, on the 3rd and 7th days of his tumah, so too a convert must be sprinkled with this water on the 3rd and 7th days after his circumcision before he can eat from a Pesach offering. And this is because of the concern that he may have come in contact with the corpse shortly before his conversion. And the Rav elaborates, a convert should really be able to eat from an offering immediately after his conversion, even if he touched a corpse just before his conversion, since a non-Jew cannot become tameh. Bet Hillel, however, are concerned that if we allow the convert to simply immerse himself in Erev Pesach and eat the Pesach offering that night, without first being sprinkled during the preceding week, he might think that he can do the same thing the next year, even if he becomes tameh from a corpse during the week before Pesach. The next year, however, he would be forbidden to do so because he is Jewish and can become tameh. Therefore, according to Bet Hillel, the proper thing is we tell the convert not to immerse himself in Erev Pesach, so that he not become a full-fledged convert and will not yet be obligated to bring a Pesach offering. The Rav does tell us, Bet Shammai Savri lo Gazrinan, Bet Shammai are not concerned for such a situation, therefore they do not make this decree.